Vampirella teams up with Victory to hunt down Dracula when the king of the vampires stakes his claim on Drakulon. We're going to talk about it in our review of Vampirella Dracula Rage number 6 from Dynamite Comics. See you in 3. Welcome back to Comical Opinions. This is our review of Vampirella Dracula Rage number 6 from Dynamite Comics. Before we get started, let's talk about the credits. This issue is written by Christopher Priest, with art and colors by Christian Rosado, letters by Taylor Esposito, and the main cover, cover A, is drawn by Lucio Perillo. Before we dig into the meat of this issue, let's talk about what happened in issue number 5. It turns out the whole thing was a dupe, orchestrated by Dracula. He convinced Victory to go along with him to save Vampirella from herself after Vampirella effectively went on a revenge quest to kill all the cult members responsible for the death of her child. But it turns out that Dracula orchestrated the whole thing behind the scenes by tipping off the cult members and forcing them to essentially take action that killed the child. That left Vampirella in a rage state, but it turns out the whole thing was designed to get Victory to get him to Vampirella so he could take some of her blood and use Victory's ring to open up a portal that would let him get to Drakulon so he could take over. That brings us to the events of issue number 6. The issue starts off with a prologue where we see Vampirella and Victory riding on horses on Drakulon, making it to a mining or a way station encampment. And they're offering money to find where Dracula has hidden himself. And when he seems to have disappeared into the underground, a lot of the locals are very resistant to giving up any information because they are intimidated by Vampirella because she's the daughter of the Black Queen, Lilith, who still has a sort of lingering negative pall over the entire planet. Which, if you've been following along with the Interstellar series from Christopher Priest, Drakulon is a terraformed planet of Vampiri that is in an alternate universe that encompasses that Earth's moon. And when they feel like they've reached a dead end, a small girl approaches them and says, "I know where Dracula is because he brings death with him." And that little girl turns out to be a supernatural spirit who is intent on making sure that Dracula does not get his way. We cut to a few days before, I guess. There's a caption that says days before in Stockholm, but that caption doesn't come till several pages later. Christopher Priest in general is very terrible about letting the reader know where they are in the story as far as locations and timelines. And if you want to read a Christopher Priest story, that's just something you're going to have to get used to. I don't know why he struggles with that, but he does. So there we are. We catch up with Vampirella and Victory at the gateway just after Dracula jumped through to Drakulon, and then they start arguing with each other over how they could each other let this happen, and then they start fighting each other. During the fight, Vampirella gets zapped to some far-off snowy, ice-based location, probably in the Arctic or the North Pole or South Pole, to cool off a little bit. Victory comes along and says, "Look, okay, that's enough of that. I know you're mad. I didn't do this. Dracula did this. He manipulated everybody. Let's just work together and find him and stop him." Then we cut back to the present, sort of ish, on Drakulon, where that little girl who is a spirit embodied takes Vampirella and Victory and leads the two of them to some kind of square or meeting area. And what they see is that the entire population of Drakulon, who's in the local region, is completely entranced by Dracula, who's up on a small stage playing the cello, because if you remember from previous issues, Dracula has been embodied through the Dracula virus in the body of a famous cello player. And he's used the music of his cello to entrance and glamour and, well, maybe not enslave, but it just enamor everyone that's within the sound of his music to respond to him in a subservient way. Then what happens is the Vampirella says, "Well, that's enough of that. I don't care what he's up to. I'm going to stop him right here and now." She charges Dracula with a knife, stabs him right through the face. But of course, as Dracula, that's not enough to kill him. But by breaking the music, that somehow stirs the entire crowd into a frenzy, and they begin attacking in a mob. So Vampirella is now surrounded by Draculonians who've been driven crazy by Dracula's music. Victory says, "Okay, that's enough of that. We got to get out of here before we get torn apart." And Victory conjures a portal and pulls Vampirella through it with her, dragging a few of the vampires with them from the mob, and that leads them to this underground cavern area where we meet another character who has been common within Christopher Priest's run. Since we're talking about Drakulon and we're talking about underground caverns, of course, the person you're going to run into is Shane, the first man on the moon from the alternate Earth, which was, at least in this parallel dimension, is called Arcadia, who's been driven mad and looks like Rasputin the Mad Monk. And Shane just starts blasting away with his mystical shotgun. Dracula has come through here, but he's gone through very quickly, and Shane is now saying, "What are you guys doing here, interrupting my peace and quiet? I'm just trying to live my life here in the underground caverns where I don't want anybody to bother me." Shane blows away all the vampires that followed Vampirella and Victory through the portal, and now there's a fight because Victory is trying to stop Shane, Vampirella is trying to stop Shane, Shane is shooting at both of them, and a big chaotic fight ensues. But eventually, they manage to subdue Shane enough to get him to stop. But then Shane starts doing what Shane does best: is he starts conjuring magical spells that he learned from Lilith. However, Shane is not as good with the magic as he thinks he is. Vampirella does a little twist and turn and spin and punch and elbow to the gut, and he knocks Shane back through to an open door that has another portal, presumably the portal that Dracula fled through after the mob was unleashed on the surface above. And then both Vampirella and Victory say, "Well, we've got no choice. We've got to go through the portal to get Shane and to get Dracula." And for that main part of the story, that's where the issue ends. But there's an epilogue with a very important development. Now we're going to describe the epilogue, but it's a heavy, heavy spoiler. So if you don't want this heavy, heavy spoiler, skip ahead or don't turn away now. Anyway, we cut to this swampy type forest area where there's an old looking antediluvian kind of house just in the middle of this swampy area. And the whole thing is guarded by these large tree plant type giants that are walking around the perimeter, guarding the house, making sure nobody interferes or interrupts. And what do we see inside the house? We see Draculina sitting on a throne. And what is she doing? She is breastfeeding Vampirella's baby, who it turns out was not killed by the cult that Dracula sicked on them, but they're somewhere along the way. We never see how or why. There was a baby swap, a baby switch, and now Draculina is in possession of Vampirella's baby. And that's where the issue ends. And that's the end of the miniseries. The rest of the story picks up in the main Vampirella title ongoing for the next month. So what do we like about this issue? There's lots of twists and turns and interesting developments. We see how the events of this issue play into the main Vampirella title, sort of loosely connected, almost kind of, but not exactly. We also now understand that why Dracula was so intent of playing the quote-unquote nice guy to help Victory help Vampirella in an indirect sort of way. It turns out it was all a big con, big manipulation. So that's a nice development. That's a curious development that you won't see coming. And then, more importantly, the last page surprise spoilery twist is a pretty big deal in the scope and the canon, overall canon of Vampirella. That's a pretty big deal. So it all plays out. It all worked together, sort of. There's a lot of weird developments to get to this point. We got to the point, and now it's over. What didn't we like about this issue? It makes things more complicated in an unnecessary way. And I'll explain, and it does it on two levels. First of all the events here play into the main Vampirella series. So if you think about it in context, there's no reason why this needed to be a separate miniseries with a strange title and why it couldn't be worked into the main title. There's no reason for this to be separate because it all blends in together. It's just sort of like taking a side step to go right back into the main title with all the same characters telling essentially parts of the same larger story. So you feel like you're reading two separate stories, but they're not. They're all interconnected in one bigger story, but there was no reason for them to be separate. So it just feels like a bit of extra padding and extra cost to tell you a story that was already in play, as it were. The second piece is some of the way these characters line up, like Shane, like Dracula, like Draculina, the way they line up with the main title doesn't line up with the main title. So in the main title, Shane is somehow working with Stan to trap Vampirella in this sort of mind dream time loop. Well, but that it tells you it picks up from the main title, picks up after the end of the series from there. That doesn't make any sense because when in the main title, Vampirella is already back on Earth, but also sort of trapped in this dream loop in an alternate reality where her life is just sort of hunky dory, and that doesn't make sense for what's been happening here. So the timelines and the sequence of events don't line up at all. So even though it should all be part of the same larger story, the pieces that do work together in a way that didn't make sense for it to be separate in a separate miniseries, but B, the pieces where they should come together and dovetail in a logical, sequential way, they don't. So and they're both of them were written by the same writer. So somehow or another, Christopher Priest is constantly confused about who's who, where is where, and what's what, and what's going on at any given time. His stories never mesh together cleanly, and that's just poor organization. I don't know what to tell you about that. That seems to be part and parcel of all of Christopher Priest's writing. But if you're trying to make sense of how this story fits into the main title, when it's all the same characters and part of the same larger story, the answer is it does and it doesn't, and that's not a good place to be. I mean, that just feels, to be blunt, I think the only way to determine it is sloppy. Let's switch gears and talk about the art from Christian Rosado. It's creepy and dark and shadowy and dramatic, and a really good presentation for this type of story. It might, in some ways, it even fits a little bit better than the main title, which is typically drawn by illustrator Ergun Gundos. This story suits the story that's being, the art, I should say, the art here suits the story much better than what is happening on the main title. Rosado gives you plenty of dark, grim, gothic kind of creepiness, and that really fits the stories well. Final thoughts. What do we think about Vampirella Dracula Rage number 6, which is the finale of this miniseries? It ends the miniseries on a strong note with a strong cliffhanger that's to be continued in the main title, which is good. The machinations of Dracula basically being the force of manipulation behind the scenes is a nice twist, and that definitely helps the narrative of the story. And the art is creepy and gothic and atmospheric in all the right ways, which is all positive. On the downside, this story feels like it's just an expansion of this main title that's already going on in the main Vampirella book. So there's no reason for it to be a separate mini-series. That doesn't seem to make sense. And now that the two are supposed to merge back together and dovetail into a continuation of how this finale ended, the characters and the timelines and who's who and where's where and what's what don't line up at all. So they're supposed to dovetail, but they don't. And so that's just poor organization and sloppy planning. But at least it looks good. Therefore, we're going to give Vampirella Dracula Rage number 6 from Dynamite Comics a 6 out of 10. The art is pretty solid. The story eventually starts to make sense, but there's just too many minuses that are offsetting the pluses. And so even though it's not a terrible comic, it's not a great one either. But let us know what you think. Have you been following this series? You like this sort of offshoot type of storytelling where it's tangential to the main title, but a little bit of a different angle? Does that seem to make sense to you? Do you like some of this interstellar stuff that Christopher Priest has dreamed up or not? We're not real big fans, but either way, I want to know your opinion and give us what do you think about this type of storytelling? Or do you want more of the classic Vampirella stories going back a few decades and whatnot? Leave a comment down below. Let us know what you think. Also, please like, share, comment, subscribe. We'd love to keep you following along and listening along and watching along. And if you like more reviews just like this one, please stay tuned through the outro.